So in this final paper that wraps up, I'm looking at Andrew Fuller. I'm involved in the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies here. Fuller is a gold mine, I think, theologically. He is a very key theologian in the Baptist tradition, but much broader than the Baptist tradition. He's at the heart of the modern missionary movement, its theological foundation, and therefore plays a key role in the globalization of Christianity. And on top of that, he is an Edwardian and is probably the leading figure in late 18th, early 19th century for the transmission of Edwardian theology to the scene of Great Britain. And so I'm going to be looking at the whole area of human fulfillment in Fuller, but I've narrowed it. I had some of the same problems that some of you did. Like, how am I going to tackle this? He doesn't talk in those terms. And I was reading Keith Thomas's book, The Ends of Life, in which he really deals with this theme. You know, what are we living for? Why are we here? And what is it that makes life a fulfilling experience? And as I'll note, he deals in that book between the onset of the Reformation in England and the apex of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And one of the chapters, and this just completely resonated with me for a variety of reasons, was on friendship and sociability. And I thought, okay, here's a prism through which we can look at Fuller in terms of his whole experience, his lived experience of human fulfillment. And so really I've narrowed it, and I suspect then if this does, as we hope, go through to publication, I'm going to have to broaden it. I'm going to have a section in here where I deal with the broader picture of fulfillment in Fuller. I begin with a quote. It's not from Fuller. It's from a contemporary, but she would have died when Fuller was 4 years old, namely Esther Edwards Burr, Jonathan Edwards' daughter. And so there's an Edwardian connection which Andrew Fuller would have appreciated. This comes from her journal. "'Tis a great mercy we have any friends. What would this world be without him? A person who looks upon himself to be friendless must of all creatures be miserable in this life. 'Tis the life of life." And her spelling is as it was rendered in her diary. In a masterful study of the various ways in which English society, between the onset of the Reformation and the apex of the Enlightenment, sought to find fulfillment and so define human flourishing, historian Keith Thomas devotes an entire chapter to those close personal relationships that fall under the rubric of friendship. As Thomas traces the history of friendship in this period of English history, he notes that it came to be based, quote, wholly on mutual sympathy and cherished for its own sake rather than for its practical advantages, end of quote. Friends were understood to be, quote, intimate companions, freely chosen, without regard to an ulterior end, end of quote, which Keith sees as a significant development in the history of friendship. Reflections on friendship as far back as the Greco-Roman era, for example, recognize the importance of affection as foundational to this human experience rather than it being merely a means to another end, such as subsistence, security, or social advancement. Gregory Nazianzus, for example, writes of his friendship with Basil of Caesarea during their time together as students in Athens in the 350s in a very long autobiographical poem, De Vita Sua. In studies, in lodgings, in discussions, I had him as companion. We had all things in common, but above all, it was God, of course, and the mutual desire for higher things that drew us to each other. As a result, we reached such a pitch of confidence that we revealed the depths of our hearts, becoming ever more united in our yearning. Given this estimation of friendship, it's no surprise that Gregory also stated, if anyone were to ask me, what is the best thing in life? I would answer, friends. Again, in the Middle Ages, Aelred of Vivaux, definitely in the Augustinian tradition, the English Cistercian monk penned a classic on the subject, Spiritual Friendship. For Aelred, genuine friendship must begin in Christ, continue in Christ, and be perfected in Christ. Such spiritual friendship is to be highly prized. In human affairs, nothing more sacred is striven for, nothing more useful is sought after, nothing more difficult is discovered, nothing more sweet experienced, and nothing more profitably possessed than friendship. For friendship bears fruit in this life and in the next. And at the beginning of the modern era, John Calvin, who has had the undeserved reputation of being harsh and unloving, also had a rich appreciation of friendship. The French Reformed historian Richard Stauffer reckoned that there were few men at the time of the Reformation who developed as many friendships as Calvin. I don't mention it here, but there was a book written recently by, I think it's Machiel Vandenberg, on the friendships of Calvin. 30 chapters, 30 friends, and I thought I knew Calvin fairly well, but there were probably 20 of those people I'd never heard of. And just a remarkable book if you want to pursue that. Two of his closest friends were his fellow reformers, Guillaume Farel and Pierre Véret. Calvin celebrated his friendship with these two men in his preface to his commentary on Titus, where he stated, "I do not believe there has ever have been such friends who have lived together in such a deep friendship in their everyday style of life in this world as we have in our ministry. I've served here in the office of pastor of you too. There was never any appearance of envy. It seems to me that you two and I were as one person, and we have shown through visible witness and good authority before men that we have among us no other understanding of friendship than that which has been dedicated to the name of Christ, has been to the present time of profit to his church, and has no other purpose but that all may be one in him with us." This brotherly friendship is expressed in the correspondence of these three men, of which we have 163 letters from Calvin to Farel, 137 from Farel to Calvin, 204 letters from Calvin to Véret, and 185 from Véret to Calvin. For all this, however, Thomas maintains that there was no precedent for the volume of extravagant claims for the life-enhancing value of intimate friendship that can be found in early modern England. Now, Thomas does not cite any 18th century particular Baptists in this claims in this regard, though he could have found statements and illustrations from this community of English descent aplenty. I'm going to focus, obviously, on the circle of friends around Andrew Fuller, but there were other groups. One thinks, for instance, of the poetess Anne Steele, and a circle of not only women friends, but pastor friends that she had in Broughton in Hampshire. Or one thinks of Anne Dutton, again, an obscure Baptist writer who wrote 50, 60 books. The most published, I think, woman theologian or a woman writing theology in the 18th century. A large circle of friends that included people like George Whitefield, John Wesley. John Wesley eventually broke off his friendship with her when she attacked him on his doctrine of Christian perfection, and he realized in his mind she did not have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. But, so there are others who one could have cited. But we're going to look at Andrew Fuller, whose main pastorate was in Kettering, Northamptonshire. Fuller's parents rented and worked a dairy farm, Soham, Cambridgeshire, and his formal education, this is about a dozen miles from Cambridge. And his formal education, ending around the age of 12, was minimal. To members of the gentry like Wilberforce, who had a deep admiration for Fuller, Wilberforce and Fuller worked very closely together during the first 2 decades of the 19th century, when there was particular pressure being made upon Baptist missionaries in India. There were a number of people in Parliament just wanted to stop expel them completely. And Fuller worked with Wilberforce to secure the legality of their presence. And to members of the gentry like Wilberforce, who had a deep admiration for Fuller, the Baptist pastor initially appeared to be the very picture of a blacksmith in his physical appearance and bearing. There's a great story of one occasion where Fuller turned up at Wilberforce's house. Wilberforce was fairly well off, and Wilberforce was in a room at one end, probably about the size of this, and Fuller's presence was announced, and Wilberforce is down the other end with his 2 sons. And he leans over and whispers to them, Do you know this man, Andrew Fuller? He's a remarkable man. Now, he looks just like a blacksmith, but he has incredible powers of theological acumen. And that the sons never forgot that little remark and recorded in their biography of their father. Converted out of a hyper-Calvinist milieu common to far too many English Baptist communities of that day, Fuller had to find his own way to a biblically sound position with regard to conversion, piety, and preaching. He later compared this theological struggle to trying to find his way out of a labyrinth. Interesting, he uses that phraseology given his Calvinist background. But though an autodidact, he became by wide admission the finest theologian the transatlantic Baptist community possessed in the late 18th and early 19th century. Footnote 12 gives a couple of comments on that, one from the 19th, one from the 20th century. But it was probably David Phillips, a 19th century Welsh biographer, who may have put it best when he called Fuller, quote, the elephant of Kettering, an allusion to the weighty theological influence that even before Fuller's death was being described as Fullerism. It's Geoffrey Nuttall, who is probably one of the most remarkable historians of the 20th century, who says it is not given to every man, in fact to very few men, to have a theological position named after them, and that before they're even dead. The first biography of Fuller, which appeared in 1816, the year following Fuller's death, was penned by his fellow Particular Baptist, John Ryland Jr. In the introduction, Ryland stated the following about his relationship with Fuller. Most of our common acquaintance are well aware I was his oldest and most intimate friend. And though my removal to Bristol above 20 years ago placed us at a distance from each other, yet a constant correspondence was all along maintained. And to me, at least, it seemed a tedious interval, if more than a fortnight elapsed, without my receiving a letter from him. Ryland's assumption of the principalship of Bristol Baptist Academy in 1793 had entailed a move to the West Country from Northampton in the Midlands, where he had pastored with his father, the colourful John Collett Ryland. You can drive that today probably in about 3 hours. In those days, it would have at least been a full day, maybe 2-day journey, depending on the stagecoach routes. No longer physically close to Fuller and Kettering, which was about 13 miles or so from Northampton, the medium of the letter became the main way that Ryland kept their friendship alive and intact. And thus, for more than 20 years, the two friends faithfully corresponded with one another. And Ryland noted, if he did not hear from Fuller at least once every 2 weeks, he found it tedious. This is an older use of the term tedious. It means painful and upsetting, not boring. And that's the way we normally use that word today. Ryland and Fuller had first met in 1776 when both of them were young men, and they were wrestling with a number of extremely important theological issues, especially those that related to the stultifying effects of hyper-Calvinism on their Baptist community and how to pursue the renewal of their churches. Within a year, they were the closest of friends. And after Fuller moved from Soham to Kettering in 1782, the two of them had frequent opportunities to talk, to pray, and to spend time together. Their friendship, unbroken till Fuller's death in 1815, was an obvious source of joy to both of them. In the year that he died, Fuller described his relationship with Ryland as, quote, a long and intimate friendship that he had lived in and hoped to die in. And 9 days before he died, Fuller asked one last request of Ryland: would he preach his funeral sermon? Ryland agreed, though it was no easy task for him to hold back his tears as he spoke. Towards the end of the sermon, Ryland reminisced about the fact their friendship had never met with 1 minute's interruption by one unkind word or thought of which I have any knowledge, and that the wound caused by the loss of this most faithful and judicious friend was something that would never be healed in this life. Let me just veer off existentially, as it were, or experientially at this point. I think he's right on that. You often hear, the whole idea of time being a healer. But I think some of the wounds that we carry in this life are the deaths of our friends. And the deeper you build into somebody, I don't think these things are healed in this life. And I think he's dead on. Ryland's statement that his friendship with Fuller had never met with 1 minute's interruption by one unkind word or thought speaks volumes about the way these two men treasured their relationship and saw it as a means of human flourishing. What had initially attracted Fuller and Ryland to one another was the discovery they shared a strong attachment to the same religious principles, a decided aversion to the same errors, a predilection for the same authors. That's Ryland's own words. In particular, the American divine Jonathan Edwards, and his thought regarding conversion and revival, spirituality, and missions. Ryland actually named one of his sons, Jonathan Edwards Ryland. His father had done this. John had been named after the great John Gill, who his father loved and wanted to be buried beside, which didn't happen. And his brother was Herman Witzius Ryland. So it's kind of a family trait. In other words, they had a fundamental aspect of a good friendship, a union of hearts. In this case, it was a oneness of soul in the shared passion for the glory of Christ and the extension of his kingdom. And yet, as Ryland went on to affirm in his biography of Fuller, their intimate friendship did not blind either of us to the defects or faults of the other, but rather showed itself in the freedom of affectionate remark on whatever happened to be wrong, whatever appeared to be wrong. Ryland went on to note that there was only one religious subject about which there was any material difference of judgment between the two friends. That subject was an extremely volatile one among the 18th century transatlantic Baptist community, the twin issues of open and closed communion and open and closed membership. The vast majority of pastors and congregations in the particular Baptist denomination, including Fuller, adhered to a policy of closed membership, that is, only baptized believers could become members of their local churches, and closed communion, that is, only baptized believers could partake of the Lord's Supper in their meeting houses. This is not the American closed communion, where the only people who can partake of the Lord's Supper are actual members of that local church. This would be anybody who had been baptized as a believer could participate in the table in other Baptist churches. Ryland, on the other hand, was of the conviction that both the Lord's Supper and the membership in the local church should be open to all Christians, regardless of whether they've been baptized as believers. He was thus committed to a policy of both open communion and open membership. When Ryland was the pastor of the College Lane Church in Northampton, for instance, one of the leading deacons of the church, a certain Thomas Trinder, did not receive believers' baptism until 6 years after he had been appointed deacon. Fuller would never have tolerated such a situation at the church at Kettering. But Ryland and Fuller were secure enough in their friendship to disagree about this controversial subject. It is the most deeply controversial subject among Baptists. All through the late 17th, it had divided John Bunyan from most of the Baptist communion, because Bunyan was of Ryland's persuasion. It's still rumbling heavily in the 19th century. And so you would find American Baptists who would write biographies of Spurgeon while he was alive. They loved him to bits. But there was always a chapter where they dealt with his communion policy, because Spurgeon was closed membership, open communion. And they were deeply critical of that issue. So you might think this is a minor issue. This is a major, major issue. The only time this theological difference really came close to disturbing their friendship was in connection with the Baptist Missionary Society's ecclesial practice at Serampore in India. Headed by William Carey, Joshua Marshman, William Ward, all of whom were friends of Ryland and Fuller, the mission adopted a policy of open communion in 1805. Writing to Fuller that year, the Serampore missionaries informed him they had come to the conviction, quote, "No one has a right to debar a true Christian from the Lord's table, nor refuse to communicate with a real Christian in commemorating the death of their common Lord without being guilty of a breach of the law of love." They went on to affirm, "We cannot doubt whether a Watts, Isaac Watts, and Edwards, Jonathan Edwards, remember how important Edwards is to them, David Brainerd, a Philip Doddridge, who is from the Midlands, just a very, very significant theological influence, George Whitefield, numerous of Fuller's friends have been converted under Whitefield, did right in partaking of the Lord's Supper, though really unbaptized, or whether they had the presence of God at the Lord's table. You need to note that when the Indian missionaries wrote back to England, it took 6 months for the letter to get back, and then 6 months for the reply to get back to India. So this is a very long, protracted discussion that would be going over for a few years. There's no Suez Canal, so everything has to go around the is it Cape of Good Horn? Good Horn or Good Hope? Good Hope. Yeah, I always forget which one it is. Fuller was deeply disturbed by this reasoning and the decision made by the Serampore missionaries, and exerted all of his powers of influence and reasoning to convince them to embrace closed communion, which they eventually did in 1811. Ryland was now upset, not slow to criticize his reversal policy, but as he later said of his disagreement with Fuller, I repeatedly expressed myself more freely and strongly to him than I did to any man in England, yet without giving him offense. Neither did Carey take offense of Fuller. When he heard of Fuller's death in 1815, he wrote almost immediately to Ryland. This is almost the first word in the letter. I loved him very sincerely. There was scarcely another man on the earth to whom I could so completely lay open my heart as I could to him. In his reflections on his friendship with Fuller, Ryland also noted their circle of close friends included John Sutcliffe, the pastor of the Baptist cause in Olney, Buckinghamshire. Sutcliffe's ministry there overlapped with John Newton, and William Cooper lived in the town as well. In fact, Sutcliffe could look out of his bedroom window and see Cooper's house just across the village square. If you ever go to England and you're in the Midlands, you need to go to Olney. It's just the town is almost exactly like the way that Newton and Sutcliffe and Cooper would remember him. And another friend, the excellent and the amiable Pierce, namely Samuel Pierce of Birmingham. Fuller penned a memoir of both of these men, a short piece on Sutcliffe following the sermon that he preached at his funeral in June of 1814, and then his one and only attempt at a major biographical study, the memoirs of the Reverend Samuel Pierce. After the first edition of the memoirs appeared in 1800, this work went through more than 30 editions and reprints on both sides of the North Atlantic by the middle of the 19th century, and in the process became something of a minor spiritual classic that cut across denominational barriers. Within 6 years of its being published in 1800, an epitome of it appeared in the Methodist Magazine, with the introductory comment made by Michael Longridge, the Methodist writer who had abridged it, saying that the religion enjoyed by Mr. Pierce is that religion we are solicitous to spread. I should mention, I'm not sure what Fuller would have thought of this. Fuller was convinced till his death that John Wesley was actually a crypto-Jesuit that had been planted in England to subvert religion. And it's just a bizarre perspective, but anyway. So it's quite striking. Again, you might think, well, they're at this point the Methodists are outside the Church of England, they're dissenters, and there was significant concern for alarm on the part of Baptists about the Methodists. 40 years later, the American Presbyterian Archibald Alexander, in an extremely positive review of what became the standard 3-volume edition of Fuller's works, noted of the memoir of Pierce, had Fuller written nothing besides his biography, he would have been a benefactor of the Christian public. Few men with whose lives we are acquainted better deserves to be held up as a model to young clergymen than Samuel Pierce of Birmingham. A quick perusal of the various editions of Andrew Fuller's works in Edward Starr's monumental Baptist bibliography reveals there were nearly twice as many editions and printings of the memoirs in the course of the 19th century as Fuller's two other most popular works, The Gospel, Its Own Witness. That's a response to the deism of Thomas Paine, and The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, which basically destroys the theological credibility of hyper-Calvinism. Fuller's portrait of Samuel Pierce was thus by far his most published literary work, and it helped crystallize a form of Baptist piety well fitted for the expansion the Baptists experienced in the British Isles and North America during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Confessional, yet Catholic in temperament, profoundly committed to a piety that was at once reformed and decidedly missional. The popularity of the memoirs would seem to corroborate the observation of J.W. Morris, one of Fuller's early biographers. The memoirs were the most useful of all Mr. Fuller's writings. Now, Pierce had died from tuberculosis, 33 years old, after wrestling with the disease for almost a full year from late October of 1798 to his actual demise on October the 10th of the following year. In the summer of 1799, he sought healing by traveling south to the slightly warmer climate of his native Devon in the West Country. Upon his return to Birmingham, where he had pastored, he found a letter of Fuller waiting for him, in which his friends asked, "There's one request which I entreat you not any account to deny me. It is, that all your papers and memorandums of the first or after religious exercise of your mind, and particularly of your exercises on going to India," as we'll see, Pierce wanted to go to India as a missionary with Carey, "may be preserved and sent to me. If I should survive you, my brother, you need not fear I will puff off your character." We would say puff up, but he's the same idea. "Any more than you would mine. We are all of us, God knows it, poor, unworthy creatures. Yet the truth may be told to the glory of sovereign grace, and I long to express my inextinguishable affection for you in something more than words. I mean, by doing something that shall be of use to your family. I hope I need not say more, and that all your papers relative to your own life and experience will be preserved." As Pierce lay dying, Fuller already realized the need to write a memoir of his friend. In this text, he gives 3 reasons that were prominent in his mind for writing such a memoir. For the glory of sovereign grace, as a way of publicly expressing what he called his inextinguishable affection for Pierce, and then as a means of helping Pierce's family financially. Though long expected, when Fuller learned of Pierce's death on a street in Scotland, he was deeply affected by his friend's death. The first scripture text that came to his mind was David's utterance in 2 Samuel 1:25-26, where the Old Testament figure was told of Jonathan's death. "O Jonathan, thou wast slain upon thy high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother." A short while later, Fuller had to take a stagecoach, and there being no room within, he sat on the outside. There were two ways of paying for a stagecoach. You could pay for an inside seat, or there were seats on the outside. They'd be on the back of the stagecoach, and there might be 2 there, maybe 3. So that means you're exposed to all the weather. And Fuller often took the outside. He would save money that way, but obviously exposing himself to all the horrors of whatever might be coming down out of the heavens. And he later recalled his fellow pastors must have wondered what was the matter with him, as either he was silent or shedding tears the greater part of the journey. It's highly significant that Fuller had the above poignant words of David that bore witness to one of the great friendships of the Bible placed on the title page of his memoirs of Pierce. Right from the outset then, Fuller's memoir of Pierce was a testimony to his great affection for his fellow Baptists. Fuller captured something of the ambience among the circle of friends in the account he gave of Pierce's desire to go to India as a missionary. Given his ardor for the advance of the gospel, it's not surprising that Pierce would be vitally involved in the formation in October 1792 of what would eventually be termed the Baptist Missionary Society, of the womb of the modern missionary movement. I should mention, it's very interesting, and I was thinking of this when I was listening to Tim's paper on Baxter. Baxter's living in tumultuous times, and the pessimism, the failure of the Puritan cause after the death of the Cromwells, the restoration of the monarchy, the inability to get comprehension back in the state church, the persecution, the revival at the end of his life of the Antinomian controversy. By contrast, Fuller lives in a deeply optimistic age. You've got European expansion, you've got just a sense of material growth of the British Empire. The British Empire is beginning to recover a little from its loss of its crown jewel, America. It's got India. And there's an optimism that undergirds, I think, Fuller's life that's just not there. And you start to realize that the outward circumstances of an age can deeply shape the way Christians respond in terms of this whole area of thinking about human fulfillment. In fact, by 1794, Pierce was so deeply gripped by the cause of modern missions, he arrived at the conviction he should offer his services to the Society and go out to India to join the first missionary team the Society had sent out, namely William Carey, John Thomas, and their respective families. He began to study Bengali on his own, and for the entire month of October 1794, which preceded the early November meeting of the Society's Administrative Committee, where Pearse's offer would be evaluated, Pearse set apart one day in every week to secret fasting and prayer to God for direction. The decision of the Society as to Pearse's status was ultimately a negative one. When the Executive Committee of the Society, composed of some of Pearse's closest friends, including Fuller and Ryland, met at Rode in Northamptonshire on November the 12th, it was of the opinion that Pearse could best serve the cause of missions at home in England. Pearse's response to this decision is related by Fuller in a letter he wrote to his wife Sarah on November the 13th. I should mention, by the way, this could have been another very fruitful area of reflection on these Baptists, namely Samuel Pearse's love letters to his wife. And it would show you, I think, very powerfully the way in which this circle of people enjoyed their families. I remember very, very vividly the first time I ever looked at the love letters in 1988. I had a day in the Regent's Park College, the Angus Library there, and they came to me in a little packet, kind of this, and a pile of them, about 75 of them, wrapped in cord. I'm pretty certain nobody had looked at them since the 1930s when E.A. Payne did a small little article on them. And it's really weird reading somebody else's love letters. I don't know if you've ever done this as a historian. I could just imagine, if I was doing a study of love letters among academics, and if I wrote to you and said, do you have any love letters to your spouses that you could let me study? You'd probably tell me to buzz off. It's you feel like you're trespassing, but both of these are with the Lord in glory, and there's much in the letters. They're tremendous letters. You could just sense the joy that Pearse takes in his wife. We have none of her letters to him, and I'm not sure why that is. She did admit at one point she wasn't a letter writer, but they're just tremendous. And anyway, Fuller, when he writes the memoirs, hardly uses them. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is that she was still living, and I can understand that. But there's things in there. He doesn't bring this side of Fuller out, Pearse out. And marriage and missions was a difficult issue because Carey had gone to India and his marriage was falling apart. And so I think that's also in the background. Anyway, that's something of the background of Sarah. She was a remarkable woman in her own right. I'm disappointed, Pearse said, that he was not allowed to go to India, but not dismayed. I ever wished to make my Savior's will my own. I am more than satisfied than ever I expected I shall be with a negative upon my earnest desires, because the business has been so conducted, I think, that if by any means such an issue could be ensured, the mind of Christ has been obtained. My dear brethren here have treated the affair with as much seriousness and affection as I could possibly desire, and I think more than so insignificant a worm could expect. After we had spent the former part of this day in fasting and prayer with conversation on the subject till near 2 o'clock, Brother Potts, Thomas Potts and Thomas King were deacons at his church in Birmingham. Brother Potts, King, and I retired. We prayed while the committee consulted. The case seemed difficult, and I suppose they were near 2 hours in deciding it. So you can imagine a whole day, 2 or 3 hours in the morning, discussing it, and then they leave the room, and 2 hours for consultation. Many of you have been on thesis defenses, and this is what comes immediately to mind. I've been doing a number this week, and you can imagine what it'd be like for the student if the thesis members are in there for 2 hours discussing it before they call him in. That would not be positive. So it probably, as time went on, Pearse started to realize what was going on. At last, time forced them to a point. Their answer I enclose for your satisfaction. I actually quoted him below. He would later send it to William Carey. Pray take care of it. It'll serve for me to refer to when my mind may labor beneath a burden of guilt another day. On one occasion in the 1990s, when I was relating this story in a lecture, this is a context, a story I think is so important in a number of ways. I was actually asked by a seminary president. Could not the committee have been wrong? And Pierce right. If during his month of fasting and prayer he believed he knew God's will for his life, and his wife was completely committed to going, was not the Baptist Missionary Society executive wrong in the decision they made? I don't always think quickly on my feet, and we might see that in the Q&A. And I just said, I don't know how to answer that. And it was about 2 years later, I was reading an article by Ralph Winter. And I don't think Ralph Winter is always the best guide to the history of missions. But there was something he said in that, it clicked. And I suddenly realized it was a completely wrong question. It comes, as I say here, that from the vantage point of the highly individualistic matrix of contemporary Western Christianity. In other words, Pierce knows the minds of Jesus. He should have just gone. You know, these other men were a drag on him, and how could they have known what God wanted for his life? And I'd realized this is not the way Pierce thought. Pierce saw himself as a band of brothers. And he was more interested in the triumph of that band's strategy than the fulfillment of his own personal desires. You may know the story, and it is not apocryphal, that Fuller would later say, when Carey came to us and said he was thinking of going to India, Carey said to us, he said, "Brethren, it is as if I've discovered a gold mine. And will you please hold the ropes and let me down into the mine?" And Fuller said, myself and Pierce and Ryland and Sutcliffe pledged we would hold them till our deaths. It's just a whole different mentality, I think, than often grips us today. The three reasons noted above by Fuller as to why he was prepared to set aside time in the midst of an extremely busy season of life to write the memoirs. And he was not a historian. This is not the sort of normal writing he did. Do not exhaust his attentions for the book. At least one other prominent reason, which touches on the notion of human fulfillment or human flourishing, needs noting. As Christian biography, Fuller's memoir is part of a genre of Christian literature that goes back to the patristic era. One thinks, for example, of works like Pontus's 3rd century life of Cyprian, or Athanasius' life of Antony, written in the following century. And yet, even as Athanasius' work, or that of his younger contemporary Gregory Nyssa, in his life of his sister Macrina, broke new ground by employing biography to commend the monastic life, so Fuller's memoir helped to break new ground by using the genre of biography to recommend the life of a missionary as an example, or an exemplar is the word I want there, of human flourishing. An account of the life of the late Reverend Mr. David Brainerd by the New England divine Jonathan Edwards has been rightly regarded as the first full missionary biography. As noted above, Fuller was deeply influenced by Edwards, and he was well acquainted with this work. In May of 1980, at the annual meeting of the Northamptonshire Association, to which Fuller's churches at Soham and Kettering belonged, it had been agreed to recommend to all who love evangelical, experimental, and practical religion, especially to our younger brethren in the ministry, to read the account of the life of the Reverend David Brainerd, published by the Reverend Jonathan Edwards of New England, as eminently calculated to display the nature of true religion and promote the power of godliness. It may well have been this recommendation that led Fuller to purchase his own copy of David Brainerd's life. Pierce also had a copy and mentions reading a portion of it in his 1794 diary. Now, with the emergence of what came to be called the modern missionary movement, in which Fuller played a key theological role, there was a need for missionary models. As he wrote the memoirs, Fuller came to see his friend's life as a fabulous example in this regard. Hence, a remark he made to Sarah Pierce, her husband, he told her, was another Brainerd. And in fact, Samuel Pierce's great-grandson, who is also the great-grandson of William Carey, Samuel Pierce Carey, in the 1920s would write a book called The Baptist Brainerd, Samuel Pierce. Fuller firmly believed Christian biography was a vital means that God had used to sanctify his ministers and his people. He thus urged a newly ordained pastor to read the lives of good men, the lives of such men as God has distinguished for gifts and graces and usefulness. And in an 1802 preface to an English edition of Samuel Hopkins' memoirs of Miss Susanna Anthony, Fuller, along with Ryland and Sutcliffe, maintained, the lives of eminently holy persons, furnished materials worthy of being recorded. A considerable part of the oracles of God consists in such records, nor is there any species of writing, perhaps, upon the whole, more interesting, instructive, or impressive. Example proves the practicability of things, which the reasonings of the flesh would represent as unattainable, and conveys reproof in a language which, while it provokes to emulation, is incapable of giving offense. Fuller and his friends went on to point out that God has lately furnished us with, I think, lovely example of pure, practical Christianity. They're thinking of Pierce. And they readily admit that. We cannot but consider Miss Anthony as a female Pierce and not inferior to him in spirituality. That again is, I think, a remarkable statement for men in the 18th century to make in terms of their attitudes to women. This is the same period of time Mary Wollstonecraft writes her book on the vindication of the rights of women, appears in 1792. And you can definitely see she has, I think, some just cause for her complaints when you kind of put it in a socio-cultural background. Pierce's life then was a model of spirituality. In Fuller's words, this is the way he kind of concludes his biography of Pierce. The governing principle of Mr. Pierce, beyond all doubt, was holy love. His friends have often compared him to that disciple whom Jesus loved. His religion was that of the heart. It is not enough to say of this affectionate spirit that it formed a prominent feature in his character. It was rather the lifeblood that animated the whole system. He seemed, as one of his friends observed, to be baptized in it. It was holy love that gave the tone to his general deportment as a son, a subject, a neighbor, a Christian, a minister, a pastor, a friend, a husband, and a father. He was manifestly governed by this principle. And thus it was that produced in him that lovely uniformity of character which constitutes the true beauty of holiness. This is completely Edwardian. There have been few men in which has been united a greater portion of the contemplative and the active, holy zeal and genuine candor, spirituality and rationality, talents that attracted almost universal applause, yet the most unaffected modesty, faithfulness in bearing testimony against evil, with the tenderest compassion to the soul of the evildoer, fortitude that would encounter any difficulty in the way of duty, without anything boisterous, noisy, or overbearing, deep seriousness with habitual cheerfulness, and a constant aim to promote the highest degrees of piety in himself and others. In that little block, that's Fuller's ideal of human flourishing. And Fuller saw it. Whether he's right or wrong, that's another question. He saw it in their midst in Samuel Pierce. In a discussion of Fuller's memoirs, Peter Morden suggests, and Peter Morden has written 2 really fine books on Fuller, that Fuller interprets Pierce's life as a model of spirituality along 4 lines. Pierce modeled biblical, Calvinistic, evangelical orthodoxy, as well as heart religion. He was able to strike the right balance between Christian activity and inner piety, and his final days showed believers how to die well. The structure of the memoirs, though, highlights the fact that for Fuller, Pierce is also the model of a true missionary. This becomes the exemplar now, I think. Although Pierce pastored Cannon Street throughout the 1790s, his pastoral ministry is not highlighted in Fuller's book. You learn hardly anything about him as a pastor in his church. Nearly the entirety of chapters 2 and 3, easily half of the book, focus on Pierce's desire to be a missionary, his personal preparation in 1794 to that end, which we've already just talked about, and then a 1796 mission to Dublin, Ireland. A whole chapter on 6 weeks of his life, where he actually, in Fuller's mind, this is what a missionary looks like. Now, he didn't go to India, but he went to Ireland. Kind of next best thing. And again, if you have to bear in mind the whole background, that for an Englishman, Ireland is a place of half-human savages. And I grew up Irish Catholic and in England and know the way the English feel about the Irish. And so it's not far-fetched. It's just across the what's called St. George's Channel or the Irish Sea there. And to go to Ireland was just to step forward is just as barbarous a place as in their minds as India. I'm giving you their perspective, not my perspective. Pierce's piety is thus presented as that of a model missionary, and Fuller is one of the first authors to provide English-speaking readers with what would henceforth become a staple part of Christian reading, namely the biography of a missionary worthy of emulation who shows what it means to truly flourish as a human being. As Paul Helm, this is the same Paul Helm. Many years ago, he wrote a number of kind of historical pieces. He's before he got into all of his philosophical stuff. As Paul Helm pointed out, here in Fuller's Members, quote, perhaps more than anywhere else, the heart of the 18th century missionary movement is laid bare. Now, what follows there is just a little thing. Again, Fuller, bringing out Fuller's friendship. Let me quote one little passage, and you've all read it, so I can jump over it. But in the middle of page 16, towards the bottom there, I think this captures the ambience of these men. Ryland records in his diary that on the January the 21st, 1788, Brethren Fuller, Sutcliffe, Carey, and I kept this day as a private fast in my study. We read the epistles to Timothy and Titus, Booth's charge to Hopkins. That's Abraham Booth, his ordination charge to Thomas Hopkins. It was a minor classic, almost as soon as it was published. Blackaby's life. This is the life of the Puritan Richard Blackaby. They probably didn't read the whole thing. This appeared in John Gillies' book on revival. And Rogers of Dedham, 60 Memorials for a Godly Life. This is roaring John Rogers, who had quite a remarkable ministry in Dedham, in Essex, under whom probably Thomas Goodwin was converted. It's the story where Goodwin went down from Cambridge to hear Rogers preach, and where Rogers impersonated the congregation and God in the pulpit. And God told the people, I'm taking your Bible from you. And then Rogers got down on the floor on his knees and looking up to heaven, please, Lord, don't take our Bible. Take our children, burn our homes, take everything, but don't take our Bible. And then he jumped up. No, God, I'm taking it. And he went back and forth like this. It sounds hokey, but had an enormous impact on that congregation. Goodwin was weeping so copiously, he couldn't get on his horse for about 15, 20 minutes out to the end of the service. And that probably was the key moment of his conversion. Notice they read all this, and then each prayed twice. And they probably prayed for 15, maybe more minutes each. This is a community that the pastoral prayer could be half an hour. Or in the case of Benjamin Bedham, probably close to an hour. There is a story of his father telling him, son, when you're in the pulpit, make sure you're in there no longer than 2 hours. Yeah, anyway, each prayed twice. Carey with singular enlargement and pungency. Our chief design was to implore a revival of the power of godliness in our own souls, in our churches, and in the church at large. I think this is so very important. It's in the matrix of friendship that these men flourish as Christians. And the Baptist Missionary Society, which would do such good globally, that comes out. Let me conclude with a quote, an apt quote from Christopher Anderson, a Scottish Baptist leader who well knew Fuller's circle of friends, and Fuller actually hoped he would be the mission secretary after his death. This is on page 17 there. In order to much good being done, cooperation, the result of undissembled love, which I think is his word for disinterested love, is absolutely necessary. I think that if God in his tender mercy would take me as one of but a very few whose hearts he will unite as the heart of one man, since all the watchmen cannot see eye to eye, though I be but one of a little band of brothers, that's where I get the quote from at the beginning of the paper, who should do so, and who should leave behind them a proof of how much may be accomplished in consequence of the union of only a few upon earth in spreading Christianity. Oh, how I should rejoice and be glad. In order to such a union, however, I am satisfied the cardinal virtues and a share of what may be considered a substantial excellence of character are absolutely necessary, and hence the importance of the religion which we possess being of that stamp which will promote these. Such a union in modern times existed in Fuller, Sutcliffe, Pierce, Carey, and Ryland. They were men of self-denying habits, dead to the world, to fame, to popular applause, of deep, extensive views of divine truth. And they had such an extended idea of what the kingdom of God ought to have been in the 19th century that they, as it were, vowed and prayed and gave themselves no rest. I think you find in that text, it's idealistic. But I think he believed also that there was such a union of hearts and soul in these men that they saw genuine, the Christian life flourishing.